My husband came home from his work conference in Vancouver holding a bouquet of peonies, smelling like someone else's perfume, while I was sitting in a hospital recliner with a needle in my arm and our newborn son sleeping in an incubator 12 feet away from me. He didn't know I knew. That was the part that kept me calm. I had found out 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon when our son was 6 days old and still under the Beely lights for jaundice that had climbed high enough to make the NICU nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto speak very carefully and very slowly to me. She had that particular tone healthcare workers use when they're trying not to frighten you while also making sure you understand that this is serious. I was sitting alone because my husband was in back-to-back client meetings and couldn't get away, and my phone was in my lap, and I was so exhausted I could barely hold my head up. He had left his iPad on the kitchen counter before the baby came. We shared a family sharing account for Apple subscriptions. I had picked it up to read something, anything, to stay awake during one of those 3 a.m. feeds in the week before the jaundice sent us back to the hospital, and a message notification had slid across the top of the screen from a name I didn't recognize. A woman's name. A pet name, actually. Something that made my stomach drop before I had even fully registered what I was reading. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because people always expect the crying. I sat in our kitchen at 3 in the morning with a 6-day-old baby attached to my chest, and I read every message in that thread going back 14 months, and I did not cry once. I felt something cold and very precise move through me, the way you feel a local anesthetic take hold. Everything went quiet and clear. My name is Rebecca. I'm 31 years old. Before I had our son, I was a senior financial analyst at a mid-size investment firm on Bay Street. I had spent 6 years building models that untangled exactly where money was going and why, and I was good at it in a way that my husband had always found slightly intimidating, though he would have never said so out loud. He married me when I was still at the firm. He always introduced me at parties as my wife. She works in finance, with a particular smile that managed to be both proud and slightly dismissive. I had taken a full year of maternity leave. In Canada, you can do that. It felt like the right thing, and I had wanted it genuinely. But somewhere in that year, I think my husband had quietly reclassified me, moved me from one column in his mind to another. I had gone from partner to dependent, from equal to manageable. His name was Garrett Ashby, 34 years old, commercial real estate developer, the kind of man who owns very nice running shoes and never actually runs. We had been married 4 years. The woman in the messages was named Amber, and she was 26, and she worked in his office building, not for his company, but for a marketing agency 2 floors down. She had been in his life, based on the timestamps, since the month I announced I was pregnant. I put the iPad back exactly where I found it. For the next 3 weeks, I did 4 things simultaneously. I cared for our son, whose name is Eli, and who had the most extraordinary eyelashes I had ever seen on a newborn. I attended every single medical appointment, asked every question the neonatologist suggested I write down, learned the difference between physiological and pathological jaundice, learned what bilirubin encephalopathy meant and what the threshold numbers were and why the phototherapy worked. I became, in those weeks, fluent in a language I had never needed before. I also made some phone calls. The first was to my closest friend from university, who had left Bay Street 3 years ago to become a family law lawyer in Mississauga. She had gone through her own divorce, which she described over wine once as the MBA I should have gotten instead. She was the only person outside a hospital I spoke to honestly during those 3 weeks. She told me exactly what I needed. She gave me a name. The second call was to a forensic accountant she recommended. He was quiet, methodical, and had a particular specialty in marital asset cases. I gave him read-only access to our joint accounts and our shared investment platforms, and I told him what I had seen on the iPad, and he said, "Give me 10 days." He needed 8. What he found was not the worst thing in the world, but it was enough. Garrett had used a secondary credit card I technically had access to, but never monitored. It was linked to a personal account he'd opened before we married, to pay for hotel rooms in Toronto and 2 weekend trips. one to Montreal and one later to a cottage rental north of Barrie. The Montreal trip had occurred when I was 26 weeks pregnant, and he had told me he was at a conference in Ottawa. The cottage had been the week before our son was born. I had been on modified bed rest. He had told me he needed to clear his head before the baby came. There was also a transfer, $8,000, sent to an e-transfer address that resolved after some digging to an account in Amber's name. The note on the transfer said loan. It was not a loan. It was not a loan. We both knew that, and now a forensic accountant knew it too. On the evening that Garrett came home with the Peonies, I had been in the NICU for 6 hours. Eli's bilirubin had spiked overnight, and the attending physician had recommended another round of intensive phototherapy. I had signed the consent forms alone, in the same careful, exhausted handwriting I had been using for 3 weeks. The line for the second parent's signature was blank, because Garrett was in Vancouver for a real estate investment conference that, I now knew, also had an amber-shaved component to it. He walked into the NICU smelling like her, or at least like a hotel that had held them both, holding flowers that cost $40 from the airport and wearing an expression I recognized as prearranged remorse. The face of a man who has rehearsed a short speech about being sorry he couldn't be there. I looked at him from across the room. I didn't say anything about what I knew. I asked him how the flights were. I let him hold Eli for 4 minutes, which was all the nurse allowed given where Eli was in his phototherapy cycle. I watched Garrett hold our son with the careful, slightly performative tenderness of a man who had not been present for any of the difficult parts, and I thought about the forensic accountant's report sitting in a password-protected folder on my laptop. And I thought about the family lawyer I had met with twice, and I thought about the conversation I'd had that morning with my mother, who had flown in from Edmonton without being asked and had been sleeping on our couch for 10 days. I thought about all of that, and I smiled, and I told Garrett I was glad he made it back. He never saw it coming. That, I think, was the part that genuinely surprised him later. He had spent months believing he was operating in a space I couldn't see. He thought my year of maternity leave, my sleeplessness, my softness around the edges, had made me smaller, less dangerous. He had forgotten, or perhaps never fully believed, what I did for a living. My specialty is finding the discrepancy, the number that doesn't match the story, the transfer that has no business reason. I had been doing it for 6 years on behalf of other people. It had taken me approximately 3 weeks to do it for myself. 2 days after he came home, Garrett went back to the office. I called my lawyer. She filed for divorce that afternoon using the documentation the forensic accountant had provided, along with a motion for an emergency preservation order on all joint assets. Under Ontario's Family Law Act, the dissipation of marital assets, which the e-transfer in the hotel charges qualified as, gives the court grounds to freeze accounts before a spouse can move money. The judge signed it the same day. Garrett found out when he tried to pull funds to cover a deposit on a new condo development project. His corporate credit line was unaffected, but his personal accounts, our joint investment accounts, and his individual TFSA and RRSP were all subject to the order pending full financial disclosure. His assistant called him. He called me. I let it go to voicemail. He came home that evening looking like a man who had been told the building he was standing in was actually on fire. I was on the couch feeding Eli, and I looked up at him with the same expression I might use for a mediocre quarterly report, attentive but not alarmed, and I said, "You should call David." David was his lawyer from a previous business matter. He was a corporate lawyer, not a family lawyer, and he was absolutely not equipped for what was about to happen to Garrett. But it seemed like the kind thing to mention. He stood in the middle of our living room for a long time, long enough that Eli finished feeding and I burped him and set him in the bassinet, all without Garrett saying anything. "How long have you known?" he finally said. Not a question, more like something collapsing. "A while," I said. "The iPad, among other things." He sat down heavily in the armchair across from me. He looked older than he had that morning. "Rebecca, you don't need to explain," I said. "I have everything I need. You should really focus on getting a family lawyer. David can give you a referral." He wanted to argue. I could see it moving across his face, the impulse to justify or minimize or reframe the way people always want to when they're caught. But there was nothing to reframe. The documents were filed. The order was served. The story was already written, and I had written it. He moved out 11 days later into a furnished rental in Liberty Village. I stayed in the house, which we co-owned, but which I had contributed significantly to through the down payment. A fact my lawyer made certain was very well documented. Ely and I settled into a quiet that felt unexpectedly like exhaling. The divorce took 8 months. Canadian family law is not punitive by design. It's meant to be equitable. But equitable, when properly documented, still told a clear story. The dissipation of marital assets resulted in an adjustment in my favor. The family home was assessed, and after negotiation, I was able to buy out Garrett's share at a value that accounted for the documented financial misconduct. Our son's child support was set at the table amount under the federal child support guidelines based on Garrett's income, plus a proportional share of his daycare and medical expenses. Garrett kept his business, he kept his car, he kept considerably less than he had expected to keep, and he knew why. I heard from a mutual friend several months later that Amber had ended things around the time the divorce proceedings started. She had apparently not been interested in a version of Garrett that came with legal fees, asset disclosures, and a toddler's scheduled custody exchanges. He had gone to her apartment after the accounts were frozen, looking for some version of comfort or solidarity, and she had told him that she had a lot going on and thought they should take some space. He had not handled this information gracefully. I did not feel sorry for him about that. I want to be honest. What I did feel in the months after everything settled was tired. And then, underneath the tired, something else. A kind of reclamation. I had spent a year shrinking, not intentionally, not because anyone demanded it, but because that's what exhaustion and new motherhood and a relationship that had quietly stopped being a partnership can do to you. And then I had been forced, in the most brutal possible way, to remember exactly who I was. I went back to the firm when Eli was 13 months old. My manager had held my position. I came back with a clarity I hadn't had before I left. The kind that comes from having dismantled something very complicated under significant pressure. Within 6 months, I had been promoted to lead analyst on a major restructuring file. I was good at it in a way that surprised even me. My mother used to say that the worst thing that ever happened to her also turned out to be the thing that showed her what she was made of. I used to find that unbearably cliched. I don't anymore. Garrett and I have a functional co-parenting arrangement. He has Eli on alternating weekends and one evening a week. He is, I will say this, a more present father in these structured windows than he ever was when we were married, and presence was assumed rather than scheduled. Eli calls him Daddy and runs to the door when he hears the buzzer. That matters to me. Whatever happened between Garrett and me, Eli deserves a father who shows up, and for now, Garrett shows up. I do not hate him. I want to be precise about that because I think people expect me to, and I understand why. What he did was a specific, calculated betrayal during a period when I was at my most vulnerable, not just postpartum, but watching my son fight through something that could have been permanent. Signing medical consent forms alone at 2 in the morning while my husband was in a hotel room with someone else. That was the thing that shifted something in me permanently, not the affair, the abandonment. But hate is expensive. It costs you attention and energy and hours you could spend on other things. I decided early on that I didn't want to spend those things on Garrett. I wanted to spend them on Eli and on my work, and on rebuilding a life that was genuinely mine. Eli is 3 now. He is the funniest person I know. He has opinions about his socks. Very strong opinions, the kind that occasionally make us both late in the mornings. And he talks to our houseplants. And last week, he told me very seriously that our neighbor's dog looked suspicious. He is healthy and bright and entirely himself. And every single day, I think about that NICU nurse with her careful voice, and I think about the version of this story that could have been different, where I was not paying attention, where I waited, where I trusted that things were fine without checking. I checked. That, in the end, was the whole thing. I'd been trained for years to look for the number that doesn't match the story, and when my own life handed me a discrepancy, I looked. There is one thing I kept from those months. It's a photograph. Just one on my phone, saved in a folder I don't open very often. It's a picture I took in the NICU when Eli was 8 days old at about 4 in the morning. He's under the phototherapy light, wearing the tiny eye mask they put on infants to protect them. His hands are raised up beside his face the way newborns hold them, like small, uncertain fists. The light makes everything in the frame blue and warm at the same time. I took that photo because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be completely alone and completely certain about him, about what I was going to do, about who I was when everything else had been stripped away. I look at it sometimes when I need to remember that I already survived the hardest version of this. I always have. There's a photo on my phone that I've looked at maybe 100 times. Eli under the Beely lights, tiny eye mask, hands raised like he's asking a question he doesn't have words for yet. I took it at 4 in the morning, alone, while my husband was in a hotel room in Vancouver. I didn't know then that I would end up thinking of that photograph as the moment the old version of my life ended and something more honest began. People ask me sometimes, carefully the way Canadians ask difficult things, whether I regret how I handled it, whether it was too calculated, too cold. I understand why they ask. There's a version of this story where I'm supposed to have cried more, confronted sooner, given him a chance to explain. But I think what they're really asking is whether a woman is allowed to be that deliberate when her heart is breaking. And my answer, after 3 years, is yes, absolutely yes. What Garrett did wasn't a mistake in the way we use that word to soften things. He made choices, repeated, specific, funded choices, during the period when I was most alone and Eli was most fragile. The cause of everything that followed lives right there, not in my anger, not in my lawyer's filing, not in the frozen accounts. The cause was him, choosing over and over again while I signed consent forms by myself at 2 in the morning. I think about integrity a lot now, not as an abstract value, but as something structural, the way a building either holds its own weight or it doesn't. Garrett's life looked solid from the outside, successful, organized, professionally respected, but underneath he had been quietly hollowing it out for 14 months. And when the pressure finally came, the whole thing came down fast. That's what happens when the foundation is built on things you're hiding. Eventually, the numbers don't add up, and someone who knows how to read numbers is going to notice. The thing I'm most grateful for, and I know this sounds strange, is that I hadn't forgotten how to think clearly. A year of maternity leave, sleep deprivation, the particular smallness that can settle over you when your world narrows to feeds and nap schedules and another person's survival. I had started to wonder if I'd lost some sharpness. I hadn't. It was just waiting. And when I needed it, I used it. I found the forensic accountant. I called my lawyer. I kept my face completely neutral while Garrett stood in our living room holding airport flowers. That capacity, the ability to act with a clear head when everything emotional in you is screaming, that's something I will protect in myself for the rest of my life. It took a crisis for me to understand how much I'd underestimated it. And then there is the part that has nothing to do with Garrett at all. The part that is just about getting up every day and doing the work of rebuilding something that is genuinely yours. The smaller firm I joined after my promotion, the mornings I drop Eli at daycare and he turns back to wave at me with his whole arm, that enormous toddler wave. The nights I cook dinner for one and don't find it sad anymore. None of that happened because of some grand transformation. It happened because I kept showing up day after day, even when I was exhausted, even when I wasn't sure what I was building toward. Persistence without a clear reward in sight is underrated. Most of the good things in my life right now were built in exactly that unglamorous way. Eli is 3. He has opinions about his socks and he talks to our houseplants, and last week he told me very seriously that the neighbor's dog looks suspicious. He is the clearest evidence I have that hard things can produce something extraordinary if you stay present for them. I always go back to that photo eventually. Blue light, tiny fists, 4 in the morning, me, alone, completely certain. That certainty didn't come from nowhere. It came from knowing who I was and refusing, even in the worst of it, to forget.